Religious syncretism. We must be extremely cautious that we never combine pagan concepts with true biblical values.
And that's basically referring to what we would call religious syncretism, and we'll illustrate this as we go along. Judges chapter 17, verse 5 and following, this man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols. Now, this guy is an Israelite, and here he is. This is the kind of thing that happened throughout the history of Israel during this period of time. He has household idols and installed one of his sons to be his priest. Now, keep in mind that syncretism involves elements of truth with elements of error. Priests certainly was an element in Israel, but here is a father who makes household idols and installed one of his sons to be his priest, to represent him, as it were, before God. And it involves idols. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever he wanted. That says it all, doesn't it? That's why all of this was taking place. And then we read on, there was a young man, a Levite, and that's significant. A Levite, just underscore that in your mind. There was a young man, a Levite, from Bethlehem in Judah, who resided within the clan of Judah. The man left the town of Bethlehem in Judah to settle wherever he could find a place. And on his way, he came to Micah's home in the hill country of Ephraim. And in the backdrop of that, you're looking at the hill country of Ephraim. And that's basically where Micah's home was. In verses 12 to 13, Micah consecrated the Levite. Why did he consecrate this young man? He was a Levite. And what did the Levites do? What was God's purpose for the Levites? It was to be the priests, the ones that handled the spiritual affairs in Israel. And so he feels justified because here comes a young man who's a Levite. So he really feels good about that. Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in Micah's house. And then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me because a Levite has become my priest." Now that's what you call incredible syncretistic thinking, basically paganism blended with the truth that God had revealed to Israel. Let me just give you a word of statement about syncretism. Religious syncretism. We see this happening time and time again in various ways during the 350-year period of the Judges. Israel mixed their belief in the one true God with their belief in false gods. That's syncretism. They blended those two concepts. Sadly, these idols became more important to them than the God who led them out of Egypt. And what they did was a blatant violation of the first two commandments God gave them at Mount Sinai. And we know what those two commandments are. You see them in Exodus chapter 20. Do not have other gods beside me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. And you must not bow down to them or worship them. And notice we already referred to what happened when Moses was up in the mountain receiving messages from God. They convinced Aaron to build this golden calf. Now, you need to keep in mind that when they built that golden calf, when they shaped it, when they bowed down to it, that was an idol that represented the God that brought them out of Egypt. That's how they saw this golden calf. They weren't denying God's existence. They just wanted a representation so they'd have something to see and touch, as it were, representing God. And somehow they missed the fact that God was revealing himself in that mountain with the lightning and the voice from heaven and giving them the Ten Commandments. They missed it and went after this false god. That had been a part of their life, obviously, in Egypt, because there were many gods in Egypt that represented these deities. And so they just blended that and said, we need a God that represents the true God. And so there you have what we call syncretism, which existed throughout the book of Judges particularly. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we read a statement in the New Testament where Paul is speaking to the Corinthians because they were engaging in syncretism. They were going down to the pagan idols, or the pagan temples where there were idols, and eating the meat and participating, as it were, in some of the rituals, even as Christians. And so Paul wrote to them and said, what agreement does Christ have with Belial, a foreign false god? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? In other words, you can't engage in that kind of worship that's pagan and still be a believer. What agreement does God's sanctuary, God's house, God's home have with idols? And so here, even in the New Testament, you see an element of syncretism. And part of that was because of the background of the Corinthians. They were idolaters. They incorporated all kinds of immorality into their worship of idols before they became believers. And it was very easy for them to gravitate back and to mix all of this together in a syncretistic way. So, the principle basically is we must be extremely cautious that we never combine pagan concepts with true biblical values. My wife and I had the privilege of visiting a number of different countries, but I remember visiting one particular country in Central America. We went into this particular city. There was a church. And we visited this church. Just visited the church. We didn't worship in the church. We visited. You know what we saw? We actually saw witch doctors inside the church, actually doing incantations to the statuary that represented various biblical personality, including Mary, statue of Mary, and some of the other idols or statuary. And basically, when these were developed, they wouldn't have considered it an idol. But here are witch doctors actually offering incense to these symbols of Christianity. And out in the courtyard was a priest conducting Mass. The priest is outside in the courtyard doing Mass. The witch doctors are inside the church engaging in worship of these statues and so forth. Now there you have an incredible illustration of syncretism. And one of the reasons that happens in terms of Christianity spreading to other countries is one of the ways in which they justify getting followers is to incorporate some of their pagan thinking into Christianity in order to get people to follow. That is syncretism. That is exactly what the children of Israel were doing. That was what was happening to this man Micah in his house, where he said, oh, here's a Levite. Here's the man who can be a priest. Now I know God's going to bless me because I have this element that we believe in. And so you see him mixing paganism and Christianity. And so we have to be very, very careful of that. Now, there is a fine line here that we need to distinguish. And that is that it is not wrong to utilize various methodologies to communicate the gospel, methodologies that would be culturally relevant and understandable to people in order to communicate the pure gospel. That's not syncretism. That is being culturally sensitive. An illustration of that, and I've used this when we were in the book of Joshua, is when they came out of the Jordan, across the Jordan, they took the 12 stones to Gilgal, and they stacked those stones up. Ordinarily, the stones were in a circle there in Gilgal to worship the false gods. God had them take stones and pile them up and point to Him. See, there wasn't anything wrong with the stones. God created the stones. And so God used the stones to illustrate to pagans around them that they worshiped the one true God. They didn't use stones to worship pagan gods. Now, there you have an illustration of utilizing something that's culturally relevant in order to help people understand what was true. The same thing is true of the tabernacle with the inner court, the Holy of Holies, the holy place. The fact is that there are other religions that have a holy place and a most holy place. You see that even in Buddhism. But the fact that God chose a holy place and a most holy place to illustrate that He was the one true God and dwelt in the most holy place, it's not wrong to utilize a concept that's true in paganism in order to get the truth across. Now, the thing we have to be careful there, and those who are missiologists are very much aware of this, is that sometimes the method can be so contaminated with sinful meaning that you actually have to avoid using a methodology because people don't differentiate the truth that's related to that methodology, which is neutral, but sometimes people will make those associations. So that takes a lot of wisdom. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is actually blending false idolatry with true worship of the one true God. And that's syncretism. And that's what was going on here. So we need to be very careful. So the question that we relate to here and relates to that principle is, how can we avoid allowing the gods of materialism, secularism, sensualism, how can we avoid allowing these gods to become part of our Christian lifestyle? See, we can become guilty of a syncretism in ways that is very subtle if we're not careful. And as I was reflecting on that question, it goes back to my personal life. As Paul addresses, not just personally, but corporately, for all believers, but Philippians 4:8, which is very personal. Finally, brothers, sisters, whatever is true, if it's true, not if it's false, because if it's related to paganism, it can be false. And that was true in this particular illustration. It was false. It was blending truth with error. So whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any moral excellence and if there's any praise, dwell on these things. That's a very important guideline in terms of keeping materialism, secularism, sensualism from becoming a part of who we are in our Christian lifestyle. And as a Christian, my lifestyle should reflect true worship, because that's what we have in Romans 12. Presenting our bodies to the Lord, a living what? Sacrifice. That's worship. Holy, acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service. Not conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we might prove what is the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. So the renewing of the mind, and this is a great guideline from this passage of Scripture. But there's another concept that I think we need to be aware of that's more corporate, and that's in Hebrews 10, 24, 25, where we're told, let us be concerned about one another in order to promote love and good works, not staying away from our meetings as some habitually do, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In other words, not only do we need personal, individual focus on the things that are true and right and just that we get from the Word of God, but we need a corporate experience where we are encouraging each other as we meet together, helping us to understand what true love and true good works are. We need the body of Jesus Christ. Every part doing its work, as we read in Ephesians 4, every joint supplying in order to be built up in love in Jesus Christ.